We got majority rule in 1967. The vast majority of the Bahamian people were not properly represented. The village of the people were not represented. In a country with 85% black people, you would expect the majority in parliament to reflect that. That was not the case. And so there was a struggle for what we call majority rule, which, as you know, was achieved on January 10th, 1967. A day which I regard as one of the most important dates in Bahamian history. The most important date, I think, since emancipation. It was that important because for the first time, we were able to control our own affairs.
Well, the birth of telecommunications started really in February 1892, 400 years after Columbus discovered the Bahamas. It started with the government and a joint venture with Marconi building a submarine cable from Jupiter, Florida to west of Goodman's Bay. It landed in Nassau, west of Goodman's Bay, and that's why the name changed to Cable Beach. And then the cable was on wooden poles up to the Vendue House. The Vendue House is where the traders met on Bay Street, and they sold the slaves and all that. So this was 1892. And then a second office, telegraph office, this is telegraph cable, was opened in the Colonial Hotel, now the British Colonial Hotel, in 1899. And then telephones came to the Bahamas in 1906 when an exchange was established with 150 telephones. And then in 1908, electricity came. And then after that happened, we ended up with the telegraph department and the telephone department joining and become the Telecom department in 1933. And then if we fast forward to 1966, there was a Telecommunications Act that out of those departments created the Bahamas Telecommunications Corporation, trading as Telecom. The government at that time did not feel that Bahamians could run a telephone department, and so they hired a company out of the United States called Page Telecommunications Company. And then majority rule came in 67. Another set of elections came where the government won, the PLP won the landslide victory in 1968. And in 1968, the employees of the corporation then picketed the head office. And at the time, Sir Arthur Folkes was the Minister of Telecommunications. And Sir Arthur Folkes tore up the management arrangement with Page Telecommunications, sent them packing, and appointed the first all-Bahamian executive team.
When I started in telecommunications in 1998, I was bored and overwhelmed because I said, this is the best kept secret in the world. Telecommunications, the whole world of telecommunications, was very closeted, and only a select set of people participated in it and knew about it, grew in it, particularly because BTC or Batelco at the time was a monopoly and a government corporation. Telecommunications today is so very different from what it was 30 years ago, but it has always been a dynamic industry. It's always moving. There's never a dull moment. It's busy, 24/7. And it really takes on a life of its own with the participants. It's telecommunications has its own language, and you have to know and understand what all the finer points are, because there's so many aspects to telecommunications. It's not just the engineering and the network, okay? It's customer service, it's marketing, it's the legal side of things, all the contracts and agreements and whatnot. It's the regulatory side of it, the compliance with the regulator, the licensing of the company, and making sure that the company is honoring the terms and conditions of the license.
First of all, I was made chairman of Telco in 1967. And in 1968, that was still in my portfolio. And it was the general idea at the time that Bahamians should take control of their own affairs. We'd done that in the political level, but that's not enough. The whole idea about doing it at the political level was to do it throughout the country.
BTC, as the regulator and the operator, obviously in a conflict of interest in retrospect, but at the time it was normal, okay? And you had a Corporation Act, the Telecom Act, which supported the regulation and licensing, as well as the operation of a telecommunications service. So there was a licensing department. They were pretty harsh. They were very good at going out, much to my distress. Anyone that tried to compete in any small way, they would just bash up the equipment. Yeah, that was the state of things up until about 1995. It was managed quite successfully. And then, of course, the Telecommunications Act of 1999 established the Public Utilities Commission, which became the regulator of telecommunications in March of 2000.
Gary Kane. I was a member of the board of directors, chairman of the audit committee, and then chairman of the board of directors of Cable Bahamas. I had a friend who was a partner of mine by the name of Phil Keeping. And Phil had sold his cable television company in New Brunswick. And he sold it for $50 million. And he was a young man. And he could stay in Canada and pay 25% tax on $50 million, or become a non-resident of Canada and pay 15% tax, which is a huge differential. So he did some research and decided that he would become a non-resident and go to the Barbados. And he had to spend at least 2 years in the Barbados, outside of Canada, to be deemed a non-resident. And he did that, and he became bored, as I knew he would, and he needed a project. So he looked around the Caribbean, because he couldn't really go back into North America for tax reasons. And it so happened that while he was doing that, the Bahamas issued a call for a cable license. And he had looked around the Caribbean and in fact had concluded before the call that the Bahamas was probably the best place for cable television because of the huge incidence of satellite dishes. I think it was 50%. So people obviously wanted the product. And its proximity to the U.S. made it a very, very valuable commodity. So as a result, when the call was issued, the applications were put together, and the group succeeded in winning the license.
Yeah, so the government of the Bahamas had a call for proposals or request for proposals in 1994, I believe it was. And many operators bid. As far as we know, we didn't actually ever get to see who bid and what they bid. But I think what separated our proposal from the pack was that most of the other proponents were suggesting they'd bring cable TV to New Providence, maybe to Grand Bahama, and almost none focused on the Family Islands. And our bid was to bring cable TV to, I think it was the 16 largest islands in the Bahamas, which would have covered at the time about 95% of the population. So that was certainly what separated us from the pack.
What I understand today was that Phil Keeping and the group from Canada had experience doing this in other provinces around Canada. They had some international experience actually operating cable TV systems in Canada. So I suspect that experience and the fact that we didn't have the industry already existing in the Bahamas, and from what I know of Phil Keeping, his desire to generally try to train Bahamians and to make sure that the workforce became upskilled, I would imagine those were key considerations for the government of the day in determining why the Canadian group was chosen.
It's kind of reverse thinking. Like, I would have thought that the winner would have been a party from the United States with all kinds of money and a huge background in cable, but in fact, the Prime Minister at the time wanted, I think, an entity outside of the United States. And he liked our bid because we weren't affiliated with any big name individuals like Ted Turner and others. We didn't pull big yachts up outside of Nassau to try to entertain people that were making decisions, etc. We had experience building smaller communities, a number of which were on islands. And coming from spending time in Wolfville, you would understand what it was like.
So we looked for a market where we could take advantage of what our experience was and what we thought we were good at, which was bringing cable TV to underserved communities that were, small by standards compared to larger cities in North America.
When they ran in 1997, they had privatization in their manifesto as one of the objectives. As soon as they became the government, were they to win again. And if they were successful in 1997, and privatization was immediately on the agenda. And a little side note, I was practicing in the private sector, and I was invited to apply for in-house legal counsel at BTC at the end of 1997. And I accepted, and I joined in January of 1998. And the minute I joined, privatization. Now, in an election campaign, you're not really focusing on what's in the manifesto, right? That's the way we function in this country. All of a sudden, privatization. And I was like, oh goodness, what have I done? I left my good job in private practice to come to a company that is about to, privatize, and my job could very well become redundant.
Cellular services came in 1988 and in 1989 to run Bahamas. So it was well established in terms of cellular services. But when cellular services was first built, people did not see the ROI on cellular. The first set of cellular services that was launched is basically to get the tourists on the ships, cruise ships passing through the islands. That was the business plan. And so from 1988 to about 1999, when we had to deal with Y2K, there were only 10,000 cellular customers in the Bahamas. You had to be a marker to have a cell phone in the car, or you were carrying the cell phone as a box on your shoulder and stuff like that. So the politicians had the rich. And so when Y2K came around, the rates were then reduced in 1999.
A lot of what happened in the telecommunications sector in the 2000s was predicated upon the fact that BTC was to be privatized. It took far longer for BTC to be privatized than anticipated. The process started in 1998, shortly after I joined, and it was discovered that the company was not ready for privatization. It had 2,200 employees, needed to be cut in half, the accounts, the financial statements were not in proper order for any potential purchasers to be satisfied that the books were, good and proper. And you needed an evaluation. What was the company worth? And that took 13 and a half years to get to the point where it was able to be sold in April of 2011 to Cable and Wireless.
When I came to Nassau as the COO in 1999, BTC revenues for long distance was $120 million. Number one revenue stream. You had probably the largest department was probably overseas department with 200-300 operators on every, coming from Inagua into Grand Bahama and Abaco in the north. By 2005, when I became CEO, the revenues had dropped from 120 million down to 20 million. Today, there's no such thing as an overseas operator. Today, there's no such thing as an ILD, International Long Distance Call. Nobody does it. And so that is the involvement of telecommunications and how you have to always find streams, revenue streams. But I grew up in Grand Bahama, as you did, and so we had cable TV for Mexico from the 60s and the 70s. The chairman, Mr. Addison Key, in 1985 visited Grand Bahama and didn't know that the telecommunications provided in the Freeport area, in Lucay area, was owned by a foreign company called Continental Telephone Companies. And so he wanted to make sure that telecommunications throughout the country was basically owned by the government. And so in 1986, they acquired the assets of Contel. Contel had the responsibility to provide the cables for CATV. We had to work a deal because Telco was charging Metro per quarter mile for the cable to be laid and to maintain the cable. And so the question was working out with Mr. Keeping and Ricky Party and the cable guys, how they were going to handle Freeport when they acquired the assets of. But, cable, like I said, we grew up watching cable. I remember the days how I was coming to Nassau and, you got to turn the antenna. Okay, stop somebody on the outside. Or turning the dish so you could get channel 10 or channel 7 in the directions. The same thing basically happened in this point in the outlying settlements of Freeport as well, 8 Mile Rock and the rest. But in Freeport, the residents of Freeport had cable, and we grew up with it.
Grand Bahama was in the fortunate position from that point of view of having a unique arrangement, the Port Authority. And that was put together in 1953, I think, where the agreement we had, some people complained today about Grand Bahama and Freeport and all the rest of it, but this agreement gave us a new city. It carved a new city out of the Pine Barren. And to do that, they gave some foreigners and investors certain concessions to do that. Now, there was a lot wrong with that arrangement, And some things have been corrected, but that arrangement, say what you like about it, gave us a second city. And some people who live in Nassau, when they go to Freeport, they are just blown away. No traffic jam, big wide roads and spaces. But again, that was given, that we got that by a special arrangement, and it's the same thing. They did cable before the rest of us,
So it certainly wasn't the plan from day one to acquire Grand Bahama Cable, but, obviously it made sense as we sort of grew into East End and the West End and had this one area in the middle that wasn't ours, so it was kind of always on the radar. Do I ever remember the first day in the office? So our office was a rented facility, an old house on Shirley Street, that the prior tenant was the Haitian embassy. So let's just say it was basic. And my first job with Cable Bahamas was to train the door-to-door sales staff, we didn't have a boardroom or a meeting room in the house on Shirley Street. So I actually did those in the basement of the Princess Margaret Hospital just down the road. But we had a sort of a core philosophy that we carried through the entire journey at Cable Bahamas, which was if we had $1 to invest, we were always going to put it in the network, not in our executive offices. And I think that mantra probably still lives today at Cable Bahamas.
At the age of, I don't know, 13 or 14 as a summer student, and I was really impressed. But then I remember the reason why I got the job was not for the $240, let me be clear about that, was because I was really interested in engineering. I thought I wanted to be an engineer. And I had that conversation with my dad, and he said, listen, well, you know, if you're interested, Frank, let me reach out to Phil and see if something can happen. And I spent a lot of my time in the head end with a guy by the name of Jim Young, and then Trevor Cuffey, who was the Bahamian understudy for the head end to Jim Young. And so I got to learn about how all these, I'm going to call them transmitters, but they're not really transmitters, these receivers, around how the signals came in, and we had these big satellites on the outside. I'm like, listen, how are we still using satellite if you know, this is supposed to be a cable company? And then I kind of learned the business around how the satellites received the actual signal, and then we rebroadcast through these receivers. So I spent a lot of my summertime really in the head end, was really where I was focused. So I really enjoyed that summer at working at Cable Bahamas, because I really got to understand and learn so much more around how cable TV was really revolutionizing the Bahamas at the time.
So the first day joining any company is always kind of, it sticks in your mind, right? And so yes, I do remember that day. I walked in, coming from BEC at the time, you have to think about the different organizations. So Cable Bahamas is a privately owned entity with ownership by the government as well. However, the way Cable Bahamas operates from then until now is different from a government-run entity. Now, there are pros and cons for both. But being at BEC at the time, I used to go with a jacket, a tie to the office. And so I remember when I walked in the door at Cable Bahamas, I had my tie on, I walked into the office at the time, and Rick Potty at the time, he said, okay, John, welcome to Cable Bahamas. So he said, you're with us, right? I said, I am. He said, well, the interview process is done. You don't need a tie anymore. Get rid of the tie, right? And from that day, we never wore, it was always a khaki slacks and a jacket if we go to a meeting, but it was more casual.
So we were a startup, a brand new entity in a brand new country with a product that nobody really understood. And at that time, we wanted to instill a culture that basically said that at Cable Bahamas, you don't work for someone, you work with someone. And I thought the best way to do that was to eliminate all the capital letters and titles. So whether it was on your business card or on the website or how you signed a contract, the chief executive officer was small c, small e, small o. So was a customer service rep, CSR. And to this day, my business card still has no capital letters. So, we were trying to build a company that could say that Cable Bahamas was a people company that serves telecommunications, not a telecommunications company that serves people.
It was good for our team because they got experience in a country that they never would have been able to spend time in a foreign country. And for a Canadian to spend time in a country like the Bahamas over an extended number of years to build this was fabulous. And they learned a lot as well. And it was obviously beneficial to the Bahamians because they got a system that they otherwise would never have gotten. We built a state-of-the-art system far beyond what was required at the time. We, and particularly Phil Keeping, was very, very knowledgeable from a technology point of view. And when we put the system in, we put a lot of fiber optics in day one, such that when and if telephony or landline telephone was allowed to go through a cable system in the Bahamas, we were ready. Now, Ingram said that will never happen, and you won't be allowed, and you're wasting your money, but we did it anyway, and we were right.
cable operators were using coax technology. Cable Bahamas, Phil Keeping and the team, they had this vision that instead of using coax copper as a backbone for the network, use fiber optic cables. And essentially, fiber optic cable at the time, and still is, was the best medium for telecommunications transmission. And so with that, you could change the electronics on the fiber, on the backbone, but you never had to really change the core infrastructure of the fiber. So as technology changed, you changed the electronics on the end, and also fiber gave you the ability to do all sorts of, basically any type of telecommunication service. So at the time, it was basically analog cable TV, video products, pay-per-view. Internet was not around just yet, certainly not in the Bahamas. But with the fiber optic backbone, it did allow for the company to be able to grow and scale into different telecommunications products, cable TV, internet, voice, cellular mobile.
We were very focused on world-class training programs, whether they were developed in-house or through the Society of Cable Television Engineers, for example. We were one of the first companies to list on the BISX Stock Exchange, which gave Bahamians a chance to own a piece of the company from day one, and even further down the road, greater ownership. We listed our preferred shares on the stock exchange, the BISX, which was the first preferred share issue I think ever listed there. And now these days, I actually spend time going to retirement parties, which is a pretty cool full circle moment when 30 years later you have, team members that started on day one retiring.
When I met Phil Keepins, it was at the shareholder meeting. I went to all the meetings. I was very vocal, but respectful. I let him know my point of view, what I liked, didn't like. And he said, I need to know who this man is. So we met. He said, cut my office anytime you want to see me, we can have a talk. And he had open door policy. I would see him anytime and we have a conversation. He was a wonderful man.
We didn't believe in fly-in management teams. What that meant was there was nobody on the team who flew in Monday morning and got out of Dodge on Friday afternoon and went to wherever they were from. If you worked for Cable Bahamas, you drank the clicks, you went to the fish fry, you raked and scraped, you read The Guardian. Oh, not sorry if I left somebody out, but you get the point.
The transition for me was very different because at the board level, you literally are just making sure strategically you're addressing issues that management has a response, but you're not really able to get into the meat of the matter. And quite frankly, I think Cable had a very generally a good perspective, social responsibility. The Cable Cares Foundation had done a lot of work. So the board level was very prestigious. Then when you get into management, you found it was very different in the sense that the issues, whether I was around at the time, I was the first Bahamian, I'm the first Bahamian CEO of Cable Bahamas. What was interesting around that is that there were legacies of the transition from foreign ownership to Bahamianization. And that was really around whether people were only made directors to make Bahamians feel like they had a role. So there was real issues around that. That, even today, people say that you only made a director because it was a way of the international executives to make Bahamians feel as if they were empowered, but the decisions were not really made by them. And so when you became into that, you dealt with that legacy, right? Because people are like, listen, is this really a Bahamian organization? I remember I was actually on the board when I got an email, and it was anonymous, that says, listen, is Cable Bahamas truly Bahamian? In fact, I have that email still today as a reference point.
It was the same as it was when we bid for a life. It was, how can we allow foreigners to own this and build this? Of course, that wasn't our intention. We had given certainly a verbal undertaking to Mr. Ingram and others that we viewed this as a technology transfer and that we would put the systems in place and over the required period of time train local people who would eventually take over all of the management and facilities, and we would leave. But it still was difficult because we were bandished in the newspapers, etc., as a foreign entity. And we weren't. We were controlled by Bahamians, but people didn't believe. It was difficult. It was a difficult time.
As a board member, there would be certain leaders in the business who would reach out and say, "Are you aware of this?" or "Are you aware of that?" And I remember distinctly going to one of the foreign Canadian directors and saying, "Listen, are you aware that this specific issue is going on?" And I myself was of the view that, listen, maybe the Canadians and the non-Bahamians were having conversations that never came to the board meeting. And what I quickly found out was that it wasn't that they weren't having the conversations. It was that literally their eyes were in, but their fingers were out. But there were real issues going on in the leadership and management of the company that eventually caused for me to be asked to initially just be executive vice chairman and spend 2 days in the office. That eventually got me to be now president and CEO of the business.
My own feeling was that this was a tremendous development for our country. It would have been a tremendous development for any country, but particularly for us as an archipelagic country. Because I remember, communications, and that includes television and all that. As a boy at Inagua, went to communicate with Nassau or to get a message to Nassau before we had telephones put in, we had to go to the wireless station, and you wrote out a message, and the wireless operator would did that. That's how we communicated, and then we got telephone service and all that. So this communications is so vitally important for any country, but more so for us as an archipelagic country. It helps to knit us together, and cable does that in a big way. It gives the Bahamian people an eye on the world, but it is also an instrument for the Bahamian people to see themselves.
To get to that point, there had to be a transfer of knowledge from those persons who were there to the Bahamians. And you could see the hunger, the thirst, the desire by a number of the Bahamians who wanted to grow and to develop. And so when you go back to 2000 or back to 1995, where we started, to now, the transition in terms of the level of expertise that the Bahamians have gleaned and how they've grown, it is absolutely phenomenal. I will personally put any member of our teams from the Bahamas, from a technical, from a development perspective, against anyone in the industry in being able to stand shoulder to shoulder to their level of knowledge and expertise. When you look back and reflect on that, again, it's the transfer of knowledge, which is very important, and then the hunger and the desire to learn and to glean that information as well.
Another thing about telecommunications, lots of money, okay? And if you're not careful, you deal in millions. Today we deal in billions. We don't talk about millions hardly anymore. We talk about billions. So if you're not careful, couple $100, you're like, that's nothing. If you let that thought pattern influence your own budget, you're going to be in trouble. So yeah, it's well paying. It's a lifetime commitment if you want it to be. It's mentally challenging, intellectually challenging. For a person. You can't slouch in telecommunications or you won't last.
I think cable impacted just about every segment of the Bahamas' economy. I think one of the largest areas would be on the labor side of things. When Cable Bahamas came in, there was one, maybe two telecommunications company. There was a Freeport cable company, which Cable Bahamas acquired. And then there was Telco, is known as BTC today, but it was Telco. That was the only other telecommunications company. And so with cable coming in, oh, and by the way, Telco didn't have cable TV. They had fixed line voice, and then later on, mobile, but they didn't have cable TV. So when cable came in, it brought opportunities for Bahamians to work in the telecommunications industry on the TV side of things, right? And so, Bahamians had the opportunity to learn about programming, about network, about technology. Cable Bahamas was a big purchaser, a big buyer of just about everything you could think of in the economy, whether it was from food to network equipment, nuts and bolts and cables. I mean, you name it, everything. Hotels, rooms for consultants or for guests or for conferences. Just about every aspect of the economy was impacted. I think we got up to 600 plus employees. So what that meant is, imagine 600 employees, 600 families, 600 plus extended families that, got their livelihood from Cable Bahamas and, their training and their expertise.
But the work didn't stop there. This is how it started. Lines were laid, systems were built, islands were linked. Not just for innovation, but for access. What was built to meet a moment outgrew it. And that's where this story stops being about history, because the network is already in motion.